Welcome to Midnight Whispers, the place where shadows cling to the ridges and ordinary people bring their darkest memories to light. Tonight we're heading deep into the Appalachian Mountains, a stretch of land so old, so restless, it feels alive. These are not campfire tales dreamed up to spook kids. They're true stories, whispered by hikers, locals, and travelers who swear they saw something watching them from the trees. Some of these accounts go back generations, twisting folklore and first-hand encounters together until you can't tell where the legend ends and the nightmare begins. If you're new here, settle in, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us each week for more true stories from places that never forget. Now, take a breath and step off the trail with me. The first story waits just beyond the tree line. Story 1. Wampus Cat. The scream that paralyzed me on Highway 36 was not entirely human, and the yellow eyes watching from the tree line belonged to something that should have died with the last Cherokee shamans. I had been driving through East Tennessee for 12 hours straight, pushing hard to make it to Johnson City before the trucking company noticed I was 3 days behind schedule. The mountain roads were empty at 2 a.m., nothing but darkness and twisted guardrails separating me from 1,000-foot drops into valleys that never saw sunlight. That was when my 18-wheeler died without warning, coasting to a stop on a stretch of highway that did not appear on any GPS map I had ever used. The engine simply quit, all electrical systems failed, and my radio went silent mid-sentence during a traffic report from Knoxville. My name is Dale Morrison, and I have been hauling freight across America for 26 years. I know every truck stop between Seattle and Miami, every mountain pass that can handle an oversized load, every shortcut that can save time when delivery schedules get tight. But that October night near Johnson City, I found myself on a road that should not have existed. The Cherokee called it the Wampus Cat, a creature born from their oldest legends about the price of forbidden knowledge. According to tribal stories, it was once a woman who violated sacred laws by spying on male ceremonies that were forbidden to her gender. The shamans cursed her to become half human and half cougar, condemning her to stalk the edges of civilization as a warning to others who might break ancient taboos. But the creature that hunted me that night was no legend. It was real, intelligent, and utterly hostile to any human presence in its territory. The Wampus Cat had adapted to modern times, learning to disable vehicles and trap travelers on remote highways where screams could echo for miles without reaching anyone who might offer help. I tried restarting the truck several times, but the engine would not even turn over. My cell phone showed no signal despite being in an area that should have had full coverage from multiple towers. Even my CB radio produced nothing but static, cutting me off from the network of drivers who normally provided constant communication across the interstate system. The silence was the first thing I noticed. No traffic sounds, no aircraft overhead, no distant hum of civilization that usually provides background noise even in rural areas. Just complete quiet that felt unnatural and threatening, like the entire world had been muted except for my immediate surroundings. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the cab to check the engine, hoping to find some simple mechanical problem that could be fixed with basic tools. But the hood was too hot to touch despite the cool mountain air, and the metal seemed to pulse with heat that had nothing to do with normal engine operation. That was when I heard the first scream. The sound came from somewhere in the forest beyond the guardrail, a cry that started like a woman in distress but escalated into something that belonged to no human throat. It was the sound of pure rage mixed with predatory hunger, delivered with volume that suggested something much larger than a normal person. My body reacted before my mind could process what I was hearing. Every muscle locked in place, my breathing became shallow and rapid, and cold sweat broke out across my skin despite the mild temperature. The scream had triggered some primitive response buried deep in human genetics, a paralyzing fear that our ancestors developed when they were still prey animals hiding from larger predators. I tried to move back toward my truck, but my legs would not respond to conscious commands. The paralysis was complete, leaving me standing exposed in the middle of an empty highway while something stalked through the darkness beyond my vision. All I could do was listen as whatever had made that terrible sound began moving through the forest with deliberate, measured steps. The footsteps were wrong, too heavy for a human, but with a rhythm that suggested bipedal movement rather than the four-legged gait of normal wild animals. They approached the road slowly, deliberately, like something that knew its prey was helpless and could take time to savor the approach. Yellow eyes appeared first, glowing in the darkness like twin headlights positioned about 6 feet off the ground. They were too large and too bright to belong to any normal forest creature, reflecting my flashlight beam with an intensity that hurt to look at directly. But more disturbing was the intelligence I saw in those eyes, a calculating awareness that marked the difference between animal instinct and conscious malice. The Wampus Cat stepped into my flashlight beam, and I understood why Cherokee shamans had created such elaborate warnings about this creature. It stood upright like a human but moved with the fluid grace of a large predator, its body covered in tawny fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its face was the most disturbing feature, shifting constantly between human and feline characteristics as different emotions played across its features. When the creature was calm, it almost looked like a tall woman wearing elaborate fur clothing. But when its predatory instincts peaked, the face would elongate into a cougar-esque muzzle, revealing teeth that were designed for tearing flesh from bone. Its hands were human-shaped but ended in claws that looked capable of shredding steel, and its legs were too long and too muscular for any normal human anatomy. The Wampus Cat circled my truck like it was conducting an inspection, never taking those terrible yellow eyes off my paralyzed form. It moved with the confidence of something that had perfected this hunting routine over many decades, possibly centuries. I was not its first victim, and the creature's behavior suggested it had learned exactly how to extract maximum fear from trapped travelers. It began making sounds that were almost like speech, vocalizations that carried the rhythm and cadence of human language but used no words I could understand. The Cherokee had said the Wampus Cat retained some human intelligence despite its transformation, and I was hearing evidence of that preserved consciousness struggling to communicate across the species barrier. But whatever the creature was trying to say, its intentions were clearly hostile. It approached my truck and began examining the engine compartment with hands that were dexterous enough to manipulate complex mechanisms. The Wampus Cat had not just stumbled onto a broken-down vehicle. It had deliberately disabled my truck using knowledge of modern automotive systems that no wild animal should possess. This was not random predation but calculated hunting, carried out by something that understood human technology well enough to use it as a weapon. The creature had learned to strand travelers on remote highways, creating perfect conditions for feeding without the risk of interruption or discovery. My paralysis began to fade as minutes passed, but I was still too terrified to attempt escape. The Wampus Cat was faster and stronger than any human, perfectly adapted for hunting in mountainous terrain that would defeat most people within hours. Running would only trigger its chase instincts, and hiding would be impossible against a predator with enhanced senses that had been tracking prey through these forests for generations. The creature finished its inspection of my truck and turned its full attention back to me, approaching with slow, deliberate steps that were designed to maximize psychological impact. It was enjoying my terror, feeding on the fear that radiated from my helpless form like heat from a furnace. The hunt was as much about psychological domination as physical predation, but something in my reaction seemed to surprise the Wampus Cat. Instead of cowering or begging, I began speaking quietly about the Cherokee legends I had heard, acknowledging the creature, its origin, and the tribal laws that had created it. I showed respect for the old stories rather than dismissing them as primitive superstition. The creature paused in its approach, tilting its head with an almost human gesture of curiosity. Its expression shifted back toward the human end of the spectrum, revealing features that might once have belonged to a Cherokee woman before the shaman's curse had twisted her into something between human and cougar. I continued speaking, sharing what little I knew about tribal customs and the sacred ceremonies that were forbidden to women in traditional Cherokee society. The creature listened with growing intensity, its yellow eyes showing emotions that went beyond simple predatory hunger. There was loneliness in those eyes, the isolation of something that existed between two worlds without fully belonging to either. The Wampus Cat had been punished for seeking knowledge that was denied to her gender, transformed into a monster as an example to others who might violate sacred taboos. But the curse had backfired in ways the shamans never intended, creating a predator that would outlive the culture that had created it and continue hunting long after the traditional Cherokee way of life had been destroyed by European colonization. She was the last remnant of a belief system that had been systematically eliminated by missionaries and government agents who saw native religions as obstacles to civilization. The Wampus Cat had become a living fossil, preserved by supernatural forces that kept ancient curses active even when the people who had created them were gone. I realized then that the creature was not just hunting for food or territory. She was hunting for connection, desperately seeking someone who might understand her story and acknowledge the injustice of her transformation. The paralysis she induced in her victims was not just a hunting technique but a way of forcing them to listen to a tale that had been told for centuries without anyone truly comprehending its meaning. But recognition did not guarantee survival. The Wampus Cat had been alone for too long, had killed too many people, had absorbed too much of the cougar's nature to simply return to human form through sympathy and understanding. She was trapped by the curse just as surely as her victims were trapped by her paralyzing scream. The creature moved closer, and I could smell the musk of a large predator mixed with something that might once have been human perfume. Her claws extended as predatory instincts overwhelmed whatever human consciousness remained. And I knew that our moment of communication was ending. But instead of attacking, the Wampus Cat did something that surprised both of us. She placed one clawed hand on my chest, directly over my heart, and I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with body heat. The creature was transferring something to me, sharing a fragment of her curse that would forever link us together. My truck engine roared to life without any mechanical intervention, all electrical systems resuming normal operation as if they had never failed. The Wampus Cat stepped back into the tree line, but her yellow eyes remained visible in the darkness as I climbed back into my cab and put the transmission in gear. I drove away from that encounter forever changed, carrying a piece of the Wampus Cat's consciousness that would never let me forget what I had experienced on that impossible highway. The creature had marked me as surely as she had been marked by the Cherokee shamans, ensuring that her story would be told to at least one person who understood its true meaning. But the gift came with a price that I did not fully understand until weeks later. My dreams began filling with images of Cherokee ceremonies that I had never witnessed, memories that belonged to a woman who had been dead for centuries. I started speaking words in a language I had never learned, experiencing emotions that belonged to someone whose identity had been stolen by an ancient curse. The Wampus Cat had shared more than just her story. She had given me a portion of her burden, the knowledge and loneliness that came with being the last keeper of secrets that the modern world had forgotten. I was becoming her chronicler, the voice that would ensure her tale survived even after she finally found the peace that had been denied to her for so long. I still drive the mountain highways of East Tennessee, but now I understand that some roads exist only for those who need to find them. The Wampus Cat continues to hunt on the edges of Johnson City, but she is more selective about her prey now, seeking only those who might understand the price of forbidden knowledge. If you ever find yourself on a highway that does not appear on any map, if your vehicle fails without mechanical cause, if you hear a scream that paralyzes your body while yellow eyes watch from the darkness, remember this story. The Wampus Cat is not just a monster but a tragedy. A woman whose curiosity was punished with eternal isolation and supernatural hunger. Show respect for the old stories, acknowledge the injustice of her transformation, and you might be allowed to continue your journey with nothing more than memories and the weight of ancient knowledge. But never forget that some curses are designed to outlast the civilizations that created them, and the Wampus Cat will be hunting these mountains long after the last human has forgotten why she exists. Story 2. Shifting sickness. The fear hit me before I even saw the abandoned houses of Mystic, West Virginia, creeping into my mind like poison seeping through cracked foundation walls. I was driving up the old mining road on a perfectly normal Tuesday afternoon, researching ghost towns for my YouTube channel about Forgotten America, when an overwhelming sense of dread settled over me like a burial shroud. My hands started shaking on the steering wheel, my breathing became rapid and shallow, and every instinct I possessed screamed at me to turn around and flee back to civilization. But there was nothing visible to justify such terror, just empty hills covered in autumn trees and the crumbling remains of a coal town that had been abandoned for 47 years. No immediate danger, no obvious threat, just the lingering presence of something that had driven an entire community insane before they disappeared into the mountains, leaving behind only empty buildings and whispered warnings about the shifting sickness. My name is Marcus Webb, and I document America as lost places for an audience that hungers for authentic exploration of our forgotten history. I have walked through dozens of abandoned towns, explored countless derelict buildings, and never encountered anything that could not be explained by time, weather, and economic decline. Mystic was supposed to be just another stop on my mapping project, another coal town that had died when the veins played out and the companies moved on. The town appeared suddenly around a bend in the mountain road, materializing from the forest like something that existed only when observed directly. 43 buildings scattered across a narrow valley, their windows dark but somehow watchful, their roofs sagging under decades of neglect but still maintaining the geometric patterns of a community that had once housed over 800 souls. But the buildings were wrong in ways that became more apparent as I parked my truck and began walking through the empty streets. The houses had been built in the 1920s, according to my research. Simple company-owned structures designed to house mining families as cheaply as possible. Yet many showed architectural details that belonged to different eras, as if the town had been constructed and reconstructed multiple times without anyone bothering to maintain historical consistency. Some houses displayed Victorian gingerbread trim that should have predated the coal operation by decades. Others incorporated Art Deco elements that would not become popular until the 1940s. A few buildings near the center of town showed modernist influences that belonged in the 1960s, long after Mystic had supposedly been abandoned. The shifting sickness had gotten its name from this architectural confusion, according to the few records I could find about the town, its final years. Residents reported that buildings would change overnight, developing new features or losing familiar details without any construction work being performed. Windows would appear in solid walls, doors would vanish from familiar locations, and the interior layouts of houses would alter themselves when no one was watching. But the physical changes were just the beginning of what drove the people of Mystic mad. I set up my camera equipment in what had been the town square, a small clearing surrounded by the company store, the church, and the administrative buildings that had controlled every aspect of life in the mining community. As I began filming my introduction, I noticed movement in the windows of the surrounding buildings, shadows that seemed too purposeful to be caused by wind or wildlife. The phantom town chatter started around sunset, just as the last natural light was fading from the valley. Voices drifted from the empty buildings, conversations conducted in normal tones but discussing impossible topics. I heard discussions about mining shifts that should have ended decades ago, complaints about company policies that no living person remembered, and social gossip involving people whose names appeared only on weathered tombstones in the overgrown cemetery. The voices were not ghostly whispers or supernatural moans. They sounded like real people having real conversations, complete with laughter, arguments, and the mundane small talk that filled the daily lives of working families. But when I approached the buildings where the sounds originated, I found only empty rooms filled with debris and decay. Lights began flickering in windows throughout the town as full darkness settled over the valley. Not the steady glow of electric bulbs, but the wavering illumination of kerosene lamps and candles that cast moving shadows on walls that should have been bare. The lights appeared and disappeared without pattern, sometimes burning steadily for minutes before suddenly extinguishing, sometimes flashing briefly like signals being passed between unseen occupants. I followed the lights from building to building, documenting everything with my cameras while fighting the growing fear that threatened to overwhelm my rational mind. The terror was not natural, not based on anything I could see or hear or touch. It felt artificial, imposed from outside like a radio signal broadcasting directly into my consciousness. This was the shifting sickness that had driven the people of Mystic mad in the months before their disappearance. Not a disease of the body, but a contagion of fear and confusion that spread through the community like wildfire, eroding their grip on reality until they could no longer distinguish between what was real and what existed only in their collective nightmares. The coal company records from 1976 described a gradual breakdown of normal social functioning as residents began reporting impossible experiences that could not be verified or explained. Miners claimed their shifts were extending into overtime hours that never appeared on company timesheets. Families reported visitors who left no footprints and delivered messages from relatives who had been dead for years. Children began attending school classes that were not on any official curriculum, taught by teachers who did not exist on the company payroll. Housewives went shopping at stores that sold merchandise from decades past, paying with currency that had not been in circulation for generations. The entire town seemed to be slipping sideways into some alternate version of itself, one where time moved according to different rules. I found evidence of this temporal confusion throughout my exploration of the abandoned buildings. Calendars showed dates from multiple years, sometimes contradictory information on the same page. Newspapers were stacked in chronological order but covered events from different decades as if they had been published simultaneously. Personal belongings were arranged in ways that suggested their owners had lived through the same experiences multiple times, accumulating possessions from lives that overlapped and intersected impossibly. But the most disturbing discovery was the realization that the shifting sickness was still active, still spreading its influence through anyone who spent too long in the abandoned town. My own perception of time began to blur as I documented the empty buildings, hours passing like minutes while minutes stretched into subjective hours. I started hearing my own voice echoing from buildings I had not yet entered, recorded conversations playing back words I had not yet spoken. My camera equipment began malfunctioning in ways that suggested it was picking up signals from sources that should not exist, displaying footage of Mystic as it had appeared during its active years superimposed over the current abandoned state. The fear intensified with each new impossibility I documented, feeding on itself until rational thought became almost impossible to maintain. I understood finally why the people of Mystic had abandoned their homes and disappeared into the mountains. Not because they had been driven away by some external threat, but because they had been driven mad by a reality that refused to follow consistent rules. The shifting sickness was not a supernatural phenomenon but a breakdown in the fundamental structure that separates past from present, memory from experience, reality from possibility. Something about the location of Mystic, possibly related to the deep mining operations that had honeycombed the mountain with tunnels, had created a weak point where different timelines could bleed through into a single shared experience. I began seeing the town as it had existed during different periods of its history, overlapping images that created a palimpsest of human activity stretching back generations. The abandoned buildings were suddenly filled with translucent residents going about their daily routines, multiple versions of the same people living parallel lives in slightly different versions of the same community. But these were not ghosts in any traditional sense. They were echoes of temporal displacement, fragments of past and future bleeding through into the present moment. The people I was seeing had actually lived in Mystic, but they were experiencing their lives simultaneously across multiple time periods, creating the confusion and terror that had ultimately driven the living residents away. I was witnessing the intersection of every moment that had ever occurred in this valley, compressed into a single overwhelming experience that no human mind could process without losing its grip on linear time. The shifting sickness was not madness but perfect sanity struggling to comprehend an impossible situation. My own timeline began to fragment as I stood in the center of the abandoned town, surrounded by the accumulated weight of 70 years of human experience occurring simultaneously. I saw myself as a child, as an old man, as someone who had never been born, all existing in the same moment while maintaining separate streams of consciousness that could not be reconciled. The terror reached a crescendo that forced me to flee back to my truck, abandoning my expensive camera equipment rather than spend another moment in that temporally unstable location. But the shifting sickness had already infected me, implanting seeds of confusion that would grow stronger over the following weeks. I drove away from Mystic with my perception of time permanently altered, no longer able to trust my memories or distinguish clearly between past and present experiences. The town had marked me as surely as it had marked every person who had ever lived within its influence, ensuring that I would carry a fragment of its temporal chaos wherever I went. The YouTube video I planned to create was never finished. My footage showed only empty buildings and normal decay, with no evidence of the impossible experiences I had documented. The shifting sickness exists only in the minds of those who have been exposed to it, a contagious breakdown of temporal perception that cannot be shared with those who have not experienced it firsthand. But the fear remains, growing stronger with each passing day as I struggle to maintain my grip on linear time. I wake up some mornings with memories of conversations that occurred years in the future, go to sleep with knowledge of events that happened decades in the past. The boundaries between different periods of my life have begun to blur, creating the same confusion that drove the people of Mystic into the mountains. I know now that I will eventually return to that abandoned town, drawn back by the same temporal displacement that has claimed every person who ever encountered the shifting sickness. Not because I want it, but because in some timeline I have already returned, and that future is bleeding backward into my present consciousness. The ghost town of Mystic still sits in its hidden valley, still broadcasting its temporal chaos to anyone foolish enough to explore its empty buildings. The phantom town chatter continues every evening as the sun sets, voices from 70 years of human activity overlapping in conversations that span generations. The flickering lights still appear in windows, illuminating rooms where multiple versions of the same families live parallel lives across different decades. And the shifting sickness continues to spread, carried by explorers and researchers who think they can document the impossible without being changed by it. Each person who visits Mystic becomes a new vector for temporal confusion, spreading the contagion to communities that exist in normal time until they too begin to experience the bleed-through of past and future into an unstable present. If you ever find yourself on an unmarked mountain road in West Virginia, if you discover a town that appears suddenly around a bend without showing up on any map, Do not stop to investigate. Do not try to document what you see there, and do not trust your equipment to record experiences that exist outside normal space-time. The shifting sickness is patient and contagious, and it has eternity to wait for new victims to wander into its influence. Mystic is not abandoned but overcrowded with the accumulated weight of every moment in its history, and there is always room for one more timeline to join the impossible chorus of voices that echo through its empty streets. I can hear them calling my name now, inviting me to return and take my place among the temporally displaced residents who exist in all times simultaneously. The fear has become familiar, almost comforting, as I prepare for the journey back to a town where past and future converge in an eternal present that no human mind was designed to comprehend. Story 3. Serpent is call. I should have turned around the moment I heard the rattling coming from inside that abandoned church. But curiosity has always been my weakness, and that October morning in the West Virginia mountains, it nearly cost me everything. My name is David, and I am a folklore researcher from Ohio State. I've been driving through the remote hollows of Appalachia, documenting dying traditions and forgotten stories. The GPS had failed me hours ago, leaving me on a winding dirt road that seemed to lead nowhere. That is when I saw it, a weathered white church perched on a hillside like a broken tooth against the gray sky. The building looked wrong from the start. The windows were boarded up, but not recently. The wood was gray with age and neglect. A crooked cross hung from the steeple, tilted at an angle that made my stomach turn. But it was the sign out front that made me pull over. Hand-painted letters, faded but still readable. Church of the Ascending Serpent. Pastor Elijah Kane, founded 1987. I heard whispers of this place in the valley towns below. Bar conversations that stopped when strangers walked in. Old-timers who decrossed themselves and changed the subject when you mentioned the mountain churches. They called it the Snake House. And according to local legend, something terrible had happened there in the winter of 1994. The story went like this. Pastor Elijah Kane had convinced his followers that handling venomous serpents would bring them closer to God. Not unusual in these parts, snake handling has deep roots in Appalachian Christianity. But Kane took it further. He claimed he could summon angels through the ritual, that the snake bites would transform his congregation into divine beings. On Christmas Eve 1994, Kane and 17 followers locked themselves inside the church with over 50 rattlesnakes, copperheads, and timber rattlers. None of them survived. The authorities found them 3 days later when concerned relatives broke down the door. 18 bodies, all bearing multiple snake bites, arranged in a circle around the altar. The snakes were gone. Every single one had vanished without a trace. The official cause of death was listed as accidental poisoning from snake venom, but the locals knew better. They said Kane had summoned something, all right, but it wasn't the angels. Standing outside that church 30 years later, I could feel the weight of that tragedy pressing down like a storm cloud. The October wind carried a strange sound, a dry, rhythmic rustling that seemed to come from inside the building. My rational mind said it was just leaves blowing around, but something deeper, more primitive, recognized that sound. I should have left then. Should have gotten back in my car and driven until I found civilization. Instead, I grabbed my audio recorder and camera from the back seat. Research instincts die hard, and this was exactly the kind of authentic local legend I'd come to document. The front door was chained shut, but I found a loose board covering a side window. It pulled away easily, as if it wanted to let me in. The interior was pitch black, but my flashlight revealed rows of wooden pews covered in decades of dust and debris. The air smelled of rot and something else, something sharp and medicinal that burned my nostrils. That is when I heard the praying. It started as a low murmur, barely audible above the wind outside. Multiple voices, all speaking at once in the fervent, breathless cadence of Pentecostal worship. I couldn't make out individual words, but the rhythm was hypnotic, rising and falling like a heartbeat. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the walls in impossible ways. My hands were shaking as I raised the audio recorder. This was it, genuine paranormal activity in one of Appalachia's most haunted locations. I did document everything, write the definitive account of the Church of the Ascending Serpent. I did be famous in academic circles, maybe even land a book deal. The praying grew louder as I moved toward the altar. In the beam of my flashlight, I could see dark stains on the wooden floor, irregular patches that looked suspiciously like dried blood. The voices were becoming more distinct now, and I caught fragments of words: glory, salvation, angels descending. But underneath the human voices, there was something else. A sound that made my skin crawl and my primitive brain scream warnings I was too proud to heed. The dry, sinuous whisper of scales against wood. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, moving in the shadows beyond my flashlight's reach. The rattling sound I heard outside was nothing compared to this, a symphony of warning calls that seemed to vibrate through my bones. I told myself it was impossible. Those snakes had died with their handlers 30 years ago. Even if some had survived, they couldn't still be here. Couldn't still be alive. Snakes done to live that long. It had to be my imagination. Trauma echoes from a place where so many people had died in terror. But when I aimed my flashlight toward the altar, I saw them. They covered every surface like a living carpet. Timber rattlers coiled around the communion rail. Copperheads draped over the pulpit like decorations. Massive diamondbacks that had no business existing in West Virginia. Their patterns gleaming in the artificial light. And all of them were watching me with eyes that held too much intelligence, too much awareness. The praying stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own ragged breathing and the thunderous pounding of my heart. The snakes didn't move, didn't strike, didn't even rattle their warnings anymore. They just watched, waiting for something I couldn't understand. That's when I saw Pastor Kane. He stood behind the altar, exactly as he must have 30 years ago. Tall and gaunt, with wild gray hair and eyes that burned with fanatical fervor. His clothes were the same ones he died in, a simple black suit now green with decay. But he was there, solid and real, holding a massive timber rattler in his upraised hands like an offering to an unseen god. "Welcome, brother," he said, and his voice was the sound of dry leaves and rattling bones. "We've been waiting for you. The angels told us you would come. I wanted to run, wanted to scream, wanted to do anything except stand there frozen like a deer in headlights. But my body wouldn't obey. I could only watch as Cain lowered the snake and stepped around the altar, his feet making no sound on the bloodstained floor. "You've come to document our story," he continued, moving closer with each word. "To tell the world about our sacrifice, our transformation. But you don't understand yet. You think we failed. You think we died." The other congregation members were rising from the pews now. Men, women, even children, all bearing the telltale puncture wounds of multiple snake bites. Their skin was gray and mottled, their eyes milky white, but they moved with purpose and intelligence that transcended death. "We didn't die," Cain whispered, now close enough that I could smell the grave dirt on his clothes. "We became something else, something necessary. The angels came, just as I promised, but they weren't what we expected. They were older, hungrier, more terrible than any heaven we imagined." I finally found my voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. "What do you want?" Cain smiled, revealing teeth blackened with venom. "To complete the ritual, of course. 18 was never enough. The angels require more. They require a witness, someone to tell the world that transformation is possible, that death is not the end." The snakes were moving now, flowing down from the altar like a river of scales and venom. I backed toward the window I entered through, but more serpents were pouring through cracks in the walls, emerging from beneath the floorboards, dropping from the rafters above. The church was alive with them, and I realized with growing horror that they weren't just snakes anymore. They moved with coordination, with purpose. Their eyes held the same terrible intelligence I'd seen in Cain, his face. These weren't animals acting on instinct. They were vessels, containers for something that had once been human. "The congregation grows," Cain said, spreading his arms wide. "Each soul we claim adds to our number, brings us closer to the final summoning. The angels hunger for this world, brother. They've been patient, but their patience has limits." I stumbled backward, my hands desperately searching for the window opening. The praying had started again, but now I could see it was the snakes themselves making the sound. A horrible, discordant mockery of human worship rising from dozens of reptilian throats. My fingers found the window frame, and I hauled myself through it like my life depended on it. Because it did. I could hear Cain laughing behind me, a sound like breaking glass and autumn wind. "Run, brother," he called out. "Tell them what you Vaccine. Tell them the Church of the Ascending Serpent still holds service every Sunday. Tell them the angels are coming. I ran through the forest, branches tearing at my clothes and face, until I reached my car. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition, but somehow I managed to start the engine and tear down that mountain road faster than was safe or sane. I drove straight through to Ohio, stopping only for gas and refusing to look anyone in the eye. When I finally reached my apartment, I locked the door, drew the curtains, and tried to convince myself it had all been a hallucination. Stress, isolation, too much local folklore poisoning my imagination. But when I played back my audio recording, I heard it all. The praying, the rattling, Cain, his voice promising that the angels were coming. And underneath it all, barely audible but definitely there, was the sound of something else. Something vast and ancient and hungry, waiting just beyond the edge of human perception. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, I've been having dreams. Dreams of snakes with human eyes, of congregations that worship things older than God, of angels with wings made of scales and venom. But the worst part is what I'm starting to see when I am awake. They were in the shadows now, watching me from storm drains and alleyways. Serpents that move like they remember being human. And yesterday, when I was walking to campus, I swear I heard hymns coming from the sewer grates beneath my feet. The Church of the Ascending Serpent is still in session, and I think they coming down from the mountains. I think they coming for all of us. The angels are hungry, and Pastor Cain was right about one thing. Transformation is possible. I can feel it starting in my dreams, in the way my skin itches when I sleep, in the new sounds I am starting to make when I pray. God help me, I am starting to pray again, and I don't think it is to the right God. If you, re-listening to this, if someone finds this recording, stay away from the mountains. Stay away from abandoned churches and places where people died believing in something terrible, because some doors, once opened, can never be closed. And I think I opened one of them. The rattling is getting closer every night. Story 4. Hungry preacher of hell for certain. Kentucky, the preacher has been talking for 17 hours straight, and I can feel my life draining away with every word he speaks. My name is Rick Coleman, and I am a long-haul trucker from Tennessee. 3 days ago, I took what should have been a simple delivery run through eastern Kentucky. I've driven these mountain roads for 22 years, hauling everything from furniture to frozen food across the Appalachians. I thought I knew every truck stop, every shortcut, every small town between Nashville and Charleston. I was wrong. Hell for certain. Kentucky ISN to on any map I've ever seen. The GPS doesn't recognize it. The CB radio goes silent when you mention it. But the town exists, tucked away in a hollow so deep between the mountains that the sun only touches it for 2 hours each day. And once you drive into hell for certain, the roads out have a way of leading you right back to where you started. I was running behind schedule when my regular route through Pine Mountain got blocked by a mudslide. The dispatcher gave me coordinates for a detour that would take me through some backwoods roads I'd never traveled. Simple enough. Follow Highway 421 until you hit County Road 15. Then wind your way through the mountains until you connect back to the interstate. The trouble started when my truck's engine began overheating about 30 miles into the detour. Steam was pouring from under the hood, and the temperature gauge was buried in the red zone. I had to find somewhere to pull over fast, or risk blowing the engine completely. That is when I saw the sign. Weathered wood, paint peeling off like dead skin, nailed to a tree at the entrance to a narrow dirt road. Hell for certain. Population 27, founded in God's name 1889. Below that, in smaller letters that looked like they'd been carved with a knife, all travelers welcome to hear the word. The road was barely wide enough for my rig, but it was the only option. I downshifted and started the slow descent into the hollow, praying I'd find a garage or at least someone with a water hose. The first thing I noticed was the silence. No insects buzzing, no birds calling, no wind moving through the trees. Just the rumble of my diesel engine echoing off the mountain walls. The second thing I noticed was the smell, something sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in a closed room. The town itself was like stepping back in time 60 years. A single main street lined with buildings that belonged in a different century. A general store with a hand-painted sign. A post office no bigger than a shed. Houses with front porches where rocking chairs sat empty, moving slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. but it was the church that dominated everything. Rising from the center of town like an accusatory finger pointed at heaven, the white clapboard building was 3 times taller than anything else in hell for certain. Its steeple stretched so high it seemed to scrape against the mountain walls that surrounded the hollow. Every window blazed with warm yellow light, and I could hear the sound of singing drifting across the empty street. I parked my truck in front of what looked like a mechanic's shop and climbed down from the cab. The moment my boots hit the ground, the singing stopped. Every light in every building went dark simultaneously, except for those in the church. And I could feel eyes watching me from behind curtained windows, though I never saw a single face. The mechanic's shop was locked tight, but a handwritten note was taped to the door. Gone to hear the word. Back when the Lord permits. Same note was on the door of the general store. Same note at the post office. Every business in hell for certain had closed down so the whole town could attend church. I checked my watch. It was 3:30 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. What kind of place held church services on Tuesday afternoon? That's when I heard the voice. It rolled across the town like thunder, rich and deep and impossibly loud. A man, this voice, speaking words I couldn't quite make out, but that seemed to reach right into my chest and squeeze my heart. The sound was coming from the church, but it was too powerful for any human throat to produce. I should have gotten back in my truck and tried to nurse the overheated engine out of town. Should have called for a tow truck on my cell phone, if I could get a signal in this mountain hollow. Instead, I found myself walking toward that church, drawn by a voice that promised answers to questions I didn't know I was asking. The church doors were solid oak, 12 feet tall and carved with scenes from the Bible. But the wood was wrong somehow. Too dark, too smooth, like it had been stained with something other than wood stain. When I pushed them open, the smell of flowers hit me like a physical force, so strong it made my eyes water. The interior of the church was impossible. From the outside, the building couldn't have been more than 40 feet long. But inside, I was looking at a space that stretched back at least 200 feet. Wooden pews filled with people, all facing forward toward a pulpit that seemed miles away. The ceiling soared overhead, supported by massive wooden beams that disappeared into shadows above the range of the flickering oil lamps that provided the only light. And at the front, behind a pulpit made from what looked like a single piece of black stone, stood the preacher. He was tall and gaunt, with wild white hair that seemed to move with a life of its own. His face was the color of old parchment, stretched tight over bones that were too sharp and too prominent. But it was his eyes that made me want to turn and run. They glowed with their own internal fire, like coals in the depths of a furnace. When he saw me enter, he smiled. His teeth were too long, too sharp, and too numerous for any human mouth. "Welcome, brother," he said without moving his lips. His voice echoed inside my head rather than reaching my ears. "You have arrived just in time to hear the word of the Lord as it was meant to be heard." I tried to back toward the door, but my feet wouldn't obey me. Instead, I found myself walking down the center aisle, past the congregation that sat in perfect silence. As I got closer, I could see that something was wrong with the people in the pews. They were too still, too pale. Their eyes stared straight ahead without blinking, and their chests didn't rise and fall with breathing. When I looked closer, I could see that their skin had a waxy quality, like candles that had been left in the sun too long. I was looking at corpses. The entire congregation was made up of dead people, dressed in their Sunday best and arranged in neat rows like dolls in a macabre display. But they weren't completely dead. As I passed each pew, heads would turn to track my movement with those glassy, unblinking eyes. Mouths would open and close silently, as if trying to warn me of something. And I could hear whispers, so faint they might have been my imagination, begging me to run while I still could. The preacher, his voice boomed through the impossible space of the church as I reached the front pew and sat down against my will. "Brothers and sisters, we have been blessed with a new soul to hear the eternal word. Let us begin again from the beginning, so that our new friend might understand the full glory of the Lord." This message. That was 17 hours ago. The preacher has been delivering the same sermon over and over, his voice never growing tired, never pausing for breath. And with each repetition, I can feel something being pulled from me. My strength, my warmth, my very life force being drawn out and absorbed by the creature at the pulpit. I would try to leave. My mind screams at my body to stand up, to run, to escape this nightmare. But I can't move anything below my neck. I can only sit and listen as the preacher speaks of damnation and salvation, of the price of sin and the cost of redemption. The worst part is that his words make sense. The longer I listen, the more I understand that everything he is saying is true. We are all sinners. We all deserve punishment. And the only way to find peace is to give ourselves completely to the Word, to let it consume us until there is nothing left but the eternal sermon. I can see my reflection in the dark windows of the church, and I am starting to look like the others in the congregation. My skin is growing pale and waxy. My eyes are losing their focus, and I can feel my heartbeat growing slower and weaker with each passing hour. The preacher made his pact over a century ago. He sold his soul for the power to deliver sermons that would never be forgotten, words that would burn themselves into the minds of everyone who heard them. But the devil's bargains always come with a price. To sustain his eternal sermon, he needs life force from the living. The people of hell for certain were the first to feed his hunger, and now they sit in his congregation forever, neither alive nor truly dead. Travelers who wander into town become the next course in his endless feast. We sit and listen as he drains us slowly, taking years of life with every word he speaks. Some resist longer than others, but we all end up the same way eventually. Part of his permanent congregation, trapped in this impossible church, listening to the same sermon for eternity. I can feel my mind starting to slip now. The preacher, his words are becoming my thoughts, his beliefs becoming my beliefs. Soon I want to remember who I was before I came to hell for certain. I'll just be another face in the crowd, another soul feeding the hungry preacher, his endless appetite. But I still have enough of myself left to send this warning. If you read driving through eastern Kentucky and you see a sign for hell for certain, don't take that road. Don't trust your GPS if it tries to route you through a town that shouldn't exist. And if you hear the sound of singing drifting through the mountains, drive faster in the opposite direction. The preacher is always hungry for new souls to join his congregation, and his sermons never end. I can hear him starting again now, his voice rolling through the church like distant thunder. The same words, the same promises, the same terrible truths. My lips are moving along with his, though I can't control them anymore. The sermon is becoming part of me, just as I am becoming part of it. Welcome, he says to someone I can see, someone who must have just walked through those impossible doors. You have arrived just in time to hear the word of the Lord as it was meant to be heard. Another traveler has found their way to hell for certain, another soul for the preacher, its eternal feast. I try to turn my head to warn them, to tell them to run while they still can. But I can move. I can only sit and listen as the cycle begins again. The preacher has been talking for 17 hours straight, and he is just getting started. If your pulse is racing, you're not alone. Subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next chilling whisper. And while you're here, drop a comment. Tell us where you're listening from, or which Appalachian tale haunts you the most. Story 5. Lovers, leap the cold hands that grabbed my ankles at Blowing Rock belonged to someone who had jumped decades before I was born, and they were pulling me toward the same 4,000-foot drop that had claimed them. I was standing at the observation deck taking photos of the Blue Ridge Mountains when I felt the grip tighten around my legs, invisible fingers digging through my jeans with supernatural strength. The tourist brochures never mentioned that the spirits of failed jumpers haunt the famous overlook, desperately trying to drag living visitors over the edge to join their eternal congregation of the heartbroken dead. My name is Tom Bradley, and I was visiting Blowing Rock, North Carolina, to scatter my wife's ashes from the scenic overlook where we had honeymooned 32 years ago. Linda had died of cancer 6 months earlier, and I thought returning to our special place would bring closure to a grief that had been consuming me since her diagnosis. The Cherokee legend says that long ago, a warrior from their tribe fell in love with a Chickasaw maiden whose people were enemies of his own. When tribal warfare separated the lovers, the warrior climbed to the highest rock formation in the mountains and leapt into the valley below, choosing death over life without his beloved. But the wind took pity on his sacrifice and blew him back up to safety, where he found his maiden waiting for him with news that peace had been declared between their peoples. The mystical wind that saved their love still blows upward from the valley, lifting leaves and light objects skyward in defiance of gravity. That is the romantic version they tell tourists, the story that made Blowing Rock a popular destination for honeymooners and marriage proposals. But the locals know a darker truth about what really happens to people who jump from the famous precipice in modern times. The wind stopped saving people sometime in the early 1900s. Around the time developers began turning the sacred Cherokee site into a commercial tourist attraction. The spirits of those who leapt expecting salvation but found only death began gathering at the overlook, trapped between the world of the living and whatever waited beyond the edge of that 4,000-foot cliff. I learned about the dark side of the legend from Martha Collins, an elderly woman who ran the gift shop near the parking area. Her great-grandfather had been the first recorded suicide at Blowing Rock in 1923, a widower who threw himself from the observation deck expecting the mystical wind to carry him to reunion with his dead wife. Instead, he fell straight down into the rocky valley. His body never recovered from the dense forest that covered the mountainside below the overlook. But witnesses claimed they saw him climbing back up the cliff face that same night, his broken form moving with impossible speed through terrain that would challenge experienced mountain climbers. Similar deaths followed over the decades, always people who jumped expecting salvation but received only gravity and stone. Each suicide added another spirit to the collection that haunted the overlook, desperate souls who had been deceived by a legend that no longer held the power to save anyone. The spirits could not rest because they had died believing in a promise that was not kept, their faith in the mystical wind transforming into bitter hatred for anyone who still lived to experience the love they had been denied. They gathered at the edge of the cliff like a supernatural welcoming committee, waiting for new victims to join their ranks. I felt their presence the moment I stepped onto the observation deck with Linda, as her hand clutched against my chest. The temperature dropped 20 degrees despite the warm October sunshine, and the famous upward wind began blowing with unusual intensity, tugging at my clothes and hair with fingers that felt almost human. But the wind was not trying to lift me skyward as the legend promised. It was trying to pull me forward, toward the railing that separated tourists from the 4,000-foot drop into Johns River Gorge. The mystical breeze that had once saved lovers now served the spirits of the failed jumpers, helping them claim new victims for their growing congregation. I tried to ignore the supernatural pressure and focus on the ceremony I had planned for Linda's ashes, but the invisible hands around my ankles made normal movement impossible. The spirits were not waiting for me to jump voluntarily. They were prepared to drag me over the edge whether I cooperated or not. The first ghost materialized near the railing, a man in 1920s clothing whose neck was bent at an impossible angle from his impact with the rocks below. His eyes held the desperate hope of someone who had expected salvation but found only betrayal, and his mouth moved silently as he tried to explain why he needed me to join him in the valley. More spirits appeared as the afternoon shadows lengthened, decades of disappointed jumpers forming a transparent crowd around the observation deck. Men and women of all ages, united only by their shared experience of falling to their deaths after being deceived by a legend that had lost its power to save anyone. They reached toward me with hands that passed through solid matter but could somehow grip living flesh with terrifying strength. I felt dozens of cold fingers clutching at my clothes, my hair, my skin, all pulling in the same direction toward the cliff edge where they expected me to complete the same tragic leap that had claimed their lives. But these were not evil spirits in any traditional sense. They were heartbroken souls who genuinely believed they were offering me salvation, convinced that jumping from Blowing Rock would reunite me with Linda in whatever realm awaited beyond death. Their intentions were compassionate even as their methods were murderous. I tried to explain that I was not suicidal, that I had come only to scatter ashes in honor of my wife, this memory, but the spirits could not hear words spoken by the living. They understood only the grief that radiated from my body like heat, and they interpreted that pain as evidence that I needed their help in choosing death over life without love. The invisible hands began pulling more insistently, dragging me forward despite my efforts to resist. The observation deck railings were only waist-high, designed for scenic viewing rather than suicide prevention, and I realized that dozens of previous visitors had probably been pulled to their deaths by these same desperate spirits. The local authorities would have classified such deaths as suicides, never suspecting that supernatural forces were involved in what appeared to be voluntary jumps from the famous overlook. The spirits had been claiming victims for over a century, adding new members to their congregation while maintaining the romantic facade that kept tourists coming to Blowing Rock. But something about my situation was different from the typical pattern of spiritual intervention. Linda had not abandoned me through infidelity or rejection. She had died of natural causes, leaving me alone but still loved, still connected to her memory in ways that death could not break. The spirits sensed this difference and began to hesitate in their efforts to drag me over the edge. Their desperate hunger for new victims was balanced by a growing recognition that my grief was different from the hopeless desperation that had driven them to suicide. I began speaking to them directly, sharing memories of Linda that proved our love had survived her death rather than being destroyed by it. I told them about the laughter we had shared during her final weeks, the peace she had found in accepting her fate, the strength she had shown in facing the unknown. The spirits listened with growing confusion, their transparent forms wavering like heat mirages as they struggled to understand how someone could experience profound loss without choosing death as an escape. Their worldview was built on the assumption that love could not survive separation, that death was preferable to living with a broken heart. But my presence at Blowing Rock was proof that their assumption was wrong. I had come not to join Linda in death but to honor her in life, to complete a ritual that would help me carry her memory forward rather than abandon it through suicide. The realization that love could transcend death without requiring suicide shattered the fundamental belief that had trapped the spirits at the Overlook for decades. They began to fade as the sun set over the Blue Ridge Mountains, finally understanding that they had been deceived not by the legend of the mystical wind but by their own despair. The Cherokee warrior and his Chickasaw maiden had been saved by the wind because their love was strong enough to survive any separation. The spirits who jumped in later centuries had died because they had given up on love rather than trusting in its power to endure beyond physical presence. As the last ghost disappeared into the mountain mist, I felt the cold hands release my ankles and the supernatural wind return to its natural pattern of lifting leaves and light objects skyward. The Overlook was peaceful again, restored to its original purpose as a place where love was celebrated rather than mourned. I scattered Linda's ashes into the valley as the stars appeared over the mountains, watching them dance on the upward breeze that carried them toward the infinite sky. But I kept a small portion to take home with me, a reminder that she would always be part of my life rather than something I had lost to death. The drive back to my hotel was quiet and reflective, filled with a sense of completion that I had not expected to find at Blowing Rock. The spirits were at peace now, freed from their decades of haunting by the simple recognition that love does not end with death if you choose to keep it alive in memory. But the experience had changed me in ways that became more apparent over the following weeks. I could see transparent figures in other locations where tragic deaths had occurred, spirits trapped by their own misconceptions about the nature of love and loss. The congregation at Blowing Rock had marked me as someone who understood the difference between healthy grief and destructive despair, making me visible to other souls who needed help in finding peace. I had become a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the spiritually confused, able to offer guidance to those who had chosen death over the harder path of living with loss. I returned to Blowing Rock every year on the anniversary of Linda's death, not to scatter more ashes but to help other grieving visitors understand that the mystical wind still has the power to save people who are willing to trust in love rather than surrender to despair. The Cherokee legend was never about supernatural intervention but about the choice between faith and hopelessness, between carrying love forward or abandoning it at the edge of a cliff. The wind blows upward from Johns River Gorge because love naturally rises above the gravity of grief when you choose to honor it rather than escape from it. The spirits no longer haunt the observation deck, but their story continues to serve as a warning about the difference between healthy mourning and destructive despair. Blowing Rock remains a place where hearts are healed rather than broken, where the mystical wind still lifts those who are wise enough to trust in love, this power to transcend any separation. If you visit the famous Overlook, remember that the legend is true but not in the way most people understand. The wind will save you if you jump, but only if you are leaping toward love rather than running away from life. The Cherokee warrior was lifted to safety because he chose faith over fear, hope over despair, connection over isolation. The same choice is available to every visitor who stands at the edge of Blowing Rock, facing the decision between trusting in love, its eternal nature, or surrendering to the gravity of loss. The mystical wind is always there, waiting to lift those who are brave enough to believe that love can survive anything, even death itself. Story 6. Hunter S. Moon. I should have listened when old Charlie Crow Feather told me to stay out of the Cherokee National Forest during the Hunter S. Moon. But I thought I knew better than some half-drunk Cherokee elders spinning tales in a Tennessee roadhouse. Now I wish I had died that night instead of living with what I saw. My name is Mike Patterson, and I am a wildlife photographer from Nashville. 3 years ago, I drove up to the Appalachian Mountains chasing stories about the legendary ghost hunters who roamed the forest under October's full moon. I thought it would make a great photo essay. I was wrong about everything. The legend goes back to 1887. 5 hunters from Knoxville came into Cherokee territory despite warnings from the tribal elders. They were after a massive black bear the Cherokee considered sacred, a creature they believed was the earthly form of their bear spirit, Yanu. The elders warned that killing Yanu would curse anyone who tried, but these men laughed off what they called savage superstition. The hunters entered the forest on October 13th, under the full hunter-s moon. Their names were carved into the guest register at Murphy's Trading Post. Jake Morrison, Tom Bradley, Samuel Hecht, William Cross, and Danny O'Brien. All experienced woodsmen, all armed with the finest rifles money could buy. All absolutely convinced they were about to bag the trophy of a lifetime. They were never seen alive again. Search parties found their campsite a week later. 5 bedrolls, still laid out around a cold fire pit. Their rifles were stacked neatly against a tree, unfired. Their horses were tied up and well fed, as if the men had simply walked away from everything they owned and vanished into the mountain mist. But the Cherokee knew what had happened. They said the hunters had found their sacred bear, all right. They said Yanu had led the men deeper and deeper into the forest, always staying just ahead of them, always just out of rifle range. The spirit bear had lured them into the heart of the mountains, where the old magic still runs strong, and transformed them into something else entirely. According to the legend, those 5 hunters are still out there. Every October, when the hunter-s moon rises full and bright, you can hear them crashing through the underbrush. You can hear their boots on the trail and their heavy breathing as they chase something they can never catch. They'd become part of the eternal hunt, doomed to pursue the same sacred bear that destroyed them, forever and always, until the mountains themselves crumble into dust. I thought it was just another colorful Appalachian ghost story until I decided to spend a night in the Cherokee National Forest and see for myself. The locals in Tellico Plains tried to warn me. The bartender at Murphy's Trading Post, the same building where those doomed hunters had signed their names over a century ago, refused to sell me supplies when I told him my plans. He said the hunter-s moon was only 3 days away, and no sensible person went into those mountains when the spirits were active. But I'd driven 4 hours from Nashville, and I wasn't about to turn back because of some local folklore. I bought my gear at a sporting goods store in town and headed up into the mountains on my own. The Cherokee National Forest covers over 600,000 acres of some of the most rugged wilderness in the southeast. Ancient mountains rise like sleeping giants, covered in oak and hickory that turned brilliant red and gold in October. During the day, it's one of the most beautiful places on earth. At night, especially under a full moon, it becomes something else entirely. I set up my camera equipment at a clearing about 6 miles into the forest, near an old Cherokee burial ground that the rangers had warned me to avoid. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was doing exactly what those doomed hunters had done, ignoring native warnings and trespassing on sacred ground. But I needed the authenticity, the connection to the original legend. The full moon rose just after 9 p.m., casting everything in silver light that made the forest look like a black and white photograph. I had my cameras ready, my audio equipment recording, and enough coffee to keep me alert all night. I was prepared for anything except what actually happened. The first sign of trouble came around 11:30. I heard them before I saw them, the sound of heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush, moving fast and desperate. But these weren't the careful, measured steps of experienced hunters. These were the panicked, clumsy movements of men who had lost all sense of woodcraft, all connection to the natural world. Then I heard the breathing. 5 sets of lungs working like bellows, gasping and wheezing with exhaustion that never seemed to ease. The sounds were getting closer, and I realized with growing unease that whoever was out there was heading straight for my clearing. I grabbed my camera and started shooting, using the telephoto lens to scan the tree line. That's when I saw the first hunter. He emerged from the shadows like something out of a Civil War daguerreotype. Tall and gaunt, wearing clothes that had once been fine but were now tattered and stained with over a century of wear. His face was pale as moonlight, his eyes hollow and desperate. In his hands, he carried an old lever-action rifle, but he held it wrong, like a man who had forgotten how to use the tools of his trade. Behind him came the others. 5 men in total, just as the legend described. They moved in single file, their heads turning constantly as if searching for something just beyond their vision. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like marionettes being pulled by invisible strings. But it was their faces that made my blood run cold. These weren't the faces of living men. The skin was too tight, stretched over skulls like leather left too long in the sun. Their eyes were black holes that seemed to absorb the moonlight instead of reflecting it. and their mouths hung open in silent screams of frustration and rage. They were hunting something, all right. I could see it in the way they held their heads, in the desperate intensity of their movements. But whatever they were chasing remained invisible to my eyes and my cameras. The lead hunter stopped at the edge of my clearing and turned his head in my direction. For a moment that lasted forever, we stared at each other across the space between the living and the dead. Then he raised one skeletal finger to his lips in a gesture that needed no translation. "Be quiet, Don, to interfere. This is not your hunt." I hardly dared to breathe as the 5 ghostly hunters passed through my clearing like smoke. They moved in perfect silence now, their boots making no sound on the fallen leaves. But I could still hear their labored breathing, still see the desperation in their movements as they searched for their eternal prey. That is when I saw what they were hunting. The bear materialized at the far end of the clearing like a shadow given form. It was massive beyond belief, easily 8 feet tall when it reared up on its hind legs. Its fur was black as midnight, but it seemed to absorb and reflect the moonlight in ways that hurt to look at directly. This wasn't just a large bear. This was something older, something that existed on the border between the physical and spiritual worlds. The Cherokee sacred bear, Yanu, in all its terrible glory. The creature looked at me with eyes that held intelligence far beyond any earthly animal. Those eyes seemed to peer straight through to my soul, measuring me, judging me, deciding whether I was friend or enemy. For a moment I thought it might charge, might end my life with one swipe of claws that looked capable of tearing through steel. Instead, it simply nodded, a strangely human gesture that acknowledged my presence and granted me permission to witness what came next. The ghostly hunters had seen their prey. Their breathing became even more labored, and they raised their ancient rifles with shaking hands. I watched through my telephoto lens as they took aim at the great bear, just as they had done every night for over a century. But their rifles were empty. They had been empty since the night they died. The hunters pulled their triggers again and again, producing nothing but the dry click of firing pins striking empty chambers. Their faces contorted with rage and frustration as they realized, once again, that their weapons were useless against their spiritual quarry. The bear watched this display with what I can only describe as infinite patience. It had played this game for over 100 years, and it would play it for 100 more. The creature was both hunter and hunted, predator and prey, locked in an eternal dance with 5 men who had been too arrogant to respect the sacred. Then something unexpected happened. The lead hunter, the one who had warned me to be quiet, suddenly turned and looked directly at me. His black eyes fixed on my camera, and I realized with growing horror that he was looking at my telephoto lens like a man dying of thirst looks at water. He wanted my camera. He wanted my modern hunting equipment. After more than a century of failure, he had finally found something that might give him the edge he needed to end his eternal torment. The hunter began walking toward me, his 4 companions following close behind. Their empty rifles were forgotten now, abandoned on the ground as they focused all their attention on the living man with the modern technology. They moved faster than before, their ghostly forms becoming more solid and threatening with each step. I should have run. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to grab my gear and flee into the forest. But I was paralyzed by the terrible understanding of what these spirits intended. They're just going to take my camera. They were going to take me, absorb my life force, use my living energy to finally achieve their impossible goal. The bear, Yanu, seemed to sense the change in the eternal game. The great creature rose to its full height and let out a roar that shook the very foundations of the mountain. It was a sound that predated human civilization, a cry of rage and power that made my bones vibrate and my vision blur. The ghostly hunters stopped their advance, torn between their original prey and this new opportunity. For a moment, the clearing was frozen in tableau. 5 dead men caught between past and present, a sacred bear defending the natural order, and one terrified photographer who had stumbled into forces beyond his comprehension. Then the bear charged. It moved with speed that defied physics, crossing the clearing in what seemed like a single bound. But instead of attacking the hunters, Yanu ran straight at me. I had just enough time to throw myself to the side before 800 pounds of spiritual bear energy crashed through the space where I had been standing. The impact sent my cameras flying, but that wasn't what the bear was after. With surgical precision, it destroyed every piece of electronic equipment I had brought, crushing my cameras and audio recorders into twisted metal and plastic. In seconds, all evidence of what I had witnessed was reduced to worthless junk. The ghostly hunters let out howls of rage that sounded like wind through a graveyard. Their one chance at breaking the eternal cycle had been destroyed, and they knew it. One by one, they began to fade, becoming transparent and insubstantial as the moon moved behind a cloud. But before the lead hunter disappeared entirely, he looked at me one final time. His mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. "This is our burden. Do not make it yours." Then they were gone, melted back into the shadows and mist of the Cherokee National Forest. The clearing was silent except for the sound of my own terrified breathing and the distant rustle of leaves in the October wind. The great bear, Yanu, stood in the center of the clearing for a long moment, watching me with those ancient, intelligent eyes. Then it too began to fade, becoming first transparent, then invisible, until I was alone with the wreckage of my equipment and the memory of what I had witnessed. I stumbled out of the forest at dawn, babbling about ghost hunters and sacred bears to anyone who would listen. The park rangers found me wandering along Highway 68, covered in scratches and completely incoherent. They assumed I had gotten lost and spent the night hallucinating from exposure and fear. The official report listed my experience as a case of hypothermia-induced delirium. My destroyed cameras were explained as damage from a bear encounter, and I was advised to stay out of the backcountry during hunting season. But I know what I saw. I know those 5 hunters are still out there, still chasing their sacred prey under every hunter, this moon. And I know why the Cherokee warned people to stay away from that cursed ground. Some hunts are never meant to end. Some prey can never be caught. And some prices are too high for mortal men to pay. Every October, when the hunter's moon rises full and bright, I can hear them in my dreams. 5 desperate men, forever chasing something they can never kill, forever paying the price for their arrogance and disrespect. I moved to Florida after that night, as far from the mountains as I could get. But sometimes, on clear October nights when the moon is full, I swear I can still hear them crashing through the underbrush of my nightmares. The hunt continues, and it always will. And somewhere in those ancient mountains, a sacred bear watches and waits, maintaining the balance between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The Cherokee were right all along. Some spirits demand respect, and some warnings should never be ignored. Story 7. Night the stars went out in Seneca. The stars are disappearing again, one by one. And I'm the only person who seems to notice that something monstrous is blocking them out. My name is Carl Thompson, and I am an amateur astronomer from West Virginia. For 37 years, they've been tracking celestial movements from my backyard observatory in the foothills of the Appalachians. What I witnessed 3 nights ago wasn't in any astronomy textbook I ever read, and it matches descriptions from a historical event that happened in 1780, an event that most people believe was just a natural phenomenon. They were wrong. I've always been fascinated by the 1780 darkness that swept across New England and parts of Appalachia. History books call it the Dark Day, caused by forest fires and atmospheric conditions that block out the sun for hours during what should have been midday. But the accounts from the Seneca Valley in West Virginia tell a different story. Witnesses described something massive moving across the sky, something that didn't just block the sun but made the very air feel heavy with dread. My great-grandfather lived in Seneca when it happened. He left behind journals that described that night in detail, writings that my family always dismissed as the ramblings of a superstitious mountain man. But after what they've seen this week, I am starting to think he was the only one who understood what really happened that night. According to his journal, the darkness came from the northwest, moving like a slow tide across the valley. But it wasn't the clouds or smoke. It was something solid, something vast beyond human comprehension, passing between the earth and the stars. He wrote that you could feel its presence pressing down on the mountains like the weight of an ocean. 3 nights ago, I was calibrating my telescope when I noticed that Polaris was flickering. Not twinkling like stars do in atmospheric turbulence, but actually going dark for seconds at a time, like something was passing in front of it. Then Cassiopeia started flickering too. Then the entire northern section of the sky began going dark in patches. I've been watching the skies long enough to know what causes stars to dim. Light pollution, atmospheric interference, equipment problems. But this was different. The stars weren't being obscured. They were being covered by something that moved with deliberate purpose across the night sky. I started photographing everything, taking long exposure shots every few minutes to document what I was seeing. The digital images showed something that my naked eye couldn't fully process. A massive shape, darker than the space between stars, moving slowly across the celestial sphere. It had structure, geometry, like some impossible architecture suspended in the void. But the most disturbing part was how it seemed to react to my observation. Each time I focused my telescope on a specific section of the shape, that area would shift slightly, as if it knew it was being watched. And the longer I stared, the more details became visible. What I thought was a smooth surface was actually textured, covered with patterns that reminded me of scales or overlapping plates. By dawn, whatever it was had moved on, and the stars returned to their normal patterns. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I witnessed something that wasn't supposed to be seen by human eyes. Something that had been crossing our skies for centuries, maybe longer, waiting for the right conditions to reveal itself fully. I spent the next day researching historical accounts of unusual celestial events. That is when I found the connection to 1780 and realized that what I'd seen wasn't unique. It was cyclical. Every 243 years, something vast and impossible crosses the skies above Appalachia, blocking out the stars and filling the air with a presence that makes every living thing want to hide. The pattern was there in the historical records, if you knew how to look for it. 1537, 1780, and now 2023. Always the same region, always the same duration, always the same descriptions from witnesses who were dismissed as superstitious or unreliable. But my great-grandfather's journal contained details that the other accounts lacked. He'd been a surveyor before he settled in Seneca, a man trained to observe and record accurately. And according to his writings, the thing in the sky wasn't just passing through. It was searching for something. He described how the darkness would pause over certain locations, hovering for hours while whatever intelligence guided it examined the terrain below. Old burial grounds, ancient rock formations, places where the Cherokee had left petroglyphs warning of sky demons that came from the void between worlds. The second night, I was ready. I moved my equipment to higher ground, setting up on Spruce Knob where the atmosphere is clearer and light pollution minimal. This time, I wasn't just going to observe. I was going to document everything and try to understand what this thing wanted. The stars started going out around 11 p.m., beginning with the same northern constellations I'd seen affected before. But this time, the darkness was larger, covering more of the sky with each passing hour. Through my telescope, I could see that the surface of the entity was more complex than I initially realized. What I thought were scales or plates were actually apertures, thousands of them, opening and closing with a rhythm that reminded me of breathing. And from some of these openings, a faint light emanated, not the warm glow of stars but something cold and blue that made my skin crawl just to look at it. The most unsettling discovery was that the thing was descending, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but definitely getting closer to Earth with each hour that passed. The stars it blocked weren't just disappearing behind it. They were being absorbed, their light drawn into those breathing apertures like water down a drain. That is when I understood what my great-grandfather had been trying to warn about in his journal. This wasn't just some massive creature passing through our solar system. It was feeding, using Earth as position relative to the stars as a kind of cosmic feeding ground. And every 243 years, when the conditions were right, it returned to continue its harvest. Around 3 a.m., one of the apertures on the entity's surface began to open wider than the others. Through my telescope, I could see movement inside it, something that looked organic but was too large and alien to properly comprehend. Tentacles, maybe, or appendages designed for grasping and pulling. And they were reaching down toward the mountains below. I should have packed up my equipment and driven home immediately. Instead, I kept watching, documenting everything, driven by a curiosity that was stronger than my fear. That is when I noticed that the appendages weren't moving randomly. They were following specific patterns across the landscape, tracing the same paths that my great-grandfather had marked in his journal. They were following the old surveyor's routes, the paths he'd taken through the mountains 2.5 centuries ago. And they were getting closer to my location on Spruce Knob with each sweep. The temperature began to drop, not gradually like it does on normal nights, but suddenly, as if something was drawing all the heat from the air. My breath came out in visible puffs, and frost started forming on my telescope's lenses. The silence was absolute. No insects, no night birds, no wind moving through the trees. Even my own heartbeat seemed muffled, as if the air itself had become too thick to carry sound properly. That is when I saw the lights in the valleys below. Not electric lights from houses or roads, but the same cold blue glow that emanated from the apertures above. They moved through the forests like search beams, illuminating trees and clearings in that unnatural radiance. And wherever the light touched, the landscape seemed to change, becoming more angular, more geometric, like reality itself was being reshaped by the entity, its attention. I realized that what I was witnessing wasn't just feeding in the traditional sense. The entity was harvesting something more fundamental than starlight. It was taking pieces of reality itself, storing them away in those countless apertures for purposes I couldn't to begin to imagine. My great-grandfather, his final journal entry made sense now. He'd written about feeling called to walk out into the darkness, to let the blue lights find him and carry him up to join whatever cosmic collection the entity was amassing. He resisted the urge, but barely, and spent the rest of his life wondering what would have happened if he surrendered to that alien summons. I was starting to feel the same pull. The longer I watched the lights moving through the valleys, the more I wanted to abandon my safe position on the mountaintop and walk down into their embrace. There was something hypnotic about their movement, something that promised answers to questions I never thought to ask. What was beyond the edge of our solar system? What other realities existed in the spaces between stars? What would it feel like to become part of something so vast and ancient? But I forced myself to stay focused on documentation. If I was going to survive this encounter, I needed to understand what I was dealing with. And the more I observed, the more I realized that the entity's pattern wasn't random. It was systematic, methodical, following a harvest schedule that spanned geological ages. Every 243 years, it returned to collect whatever had grown or developed since its last visit. Stars, planets, possibly entire civilizations, all gathered up and stored away in those breathing apertures like specimens in some cosmic museum. Earth was next on the collection list, the third night confirmed my worst fears. The entity had descended even further, close enough now that I could see individual details of its construction. It wasn't the living creature in any sense I could understand, but it wasn't a machine either. It was something else entirely, something that existed in the spaces between those categories. The apertures were opening wider, and more of those grasping appendages were emerging, reaching down toward the mountain peaks. I could feel the pull more strongly now, an almost physical force trying to draw me up into the sky. My equipment was behaving strangely too. Compasses spinning wildly, electronic devices shutting down randomly, as if the entity's presence was interfering with the fundamental forces that held matter together. But I also noticed something that gave me hope. The pattern of lights in the valleys was incomplete. There were gaps, dark areas that the blue radiance couldn't penetrate. And when I cross-referenced these locations with my great-grandfather's maps, I realized they corresponded to places he demarked as safe zones, areas where the Cherokee petroglyphs were most concentrated. The ancient warnings weren't just superstition. They were instructions, left by people who had survived previous visits from the entity. The rock carvings weren't just art. They were some kind of protective barrier, a technology or ritual that could shield small areas from the cosmic harvest. I spent the rest of that night relocating to one of these protected zones, an outcropping of rock covered with petroglyphs that depicted winged serpents descending from the sky. As soon as I entered the area marked by the carvings, the pull from above lessened, and the blue lights seemed to bend around the location like water flowing around a stone. From this sanctuary, I watched as the entity completed its harvest. Stars disappeared from entire sections of the sky, drawn up into those hungry apertures. Mountains in the distance seemed to flatten and blur, as if pieces of them were being carefully extracted and collected. And through it all, that sense of vast intelligence directing the process, deciding what was worth preserving and what could be left behind. As dawn approached, the entity began to withdraw, ascending back into the depths of space with its cosmic cargo. The missing stars slowly reappeared, though I suspected they were different stars now, replacements drawn from other parts of the galaxy to fill the gaps in our local sky. The mountains returned to their normal shapes, though subtle changes remained. New rock formations here, slightly different tree lines there. Most people want to notice these alterations. The changes are too small, too gradual, spread out across the entire region. But anyone who knows the mountains intimately will sense that something is different. That the landscape has been subtly rearranged by forces beyond human understanding. The entity is gone now, returned to whatever realm it inhabits between its harvests. But it will be back in 243 years, following the same pattern it has maintained for millennia. And when it returns, it will find an Earth that has had nearly 2.5 centuries to develop new things worth collecting. I'm writing this account because someone needs to know what is really happening in the skies above Appalachia. The Cherokee understood, and they left warnings carved in stone for future generations. My great-grandfather understood, and he left detailed records that his family dismissed as fantasy. Now it's my turn to leave a warning for whoever will be here in 2266. The stars will go out again, the darkness will descend, and something vast and hungry will come to harvest whatever we built in its absence. But the petroglyphs are still there, waiting in the mountains. And if you know where to look, if you understand what the ancient symbols mean, you can find sanctuary in the places where the Cherokee learned to hide from the sky demons. Because the night the stars went out in Seneca wasn't the end of anything. It was just the beginning of a cycle that stretches back to the dawn of time and forward to the end of everything we know. The entity is patient. It can wait. The question is, will we be ready when it returns? Story 8, Screaming Skull of Booger Hole. I should have turned around the moment I heard that scream. It wasn't the human. It wasn't the animal. It was something else entirely, echoing through the mountains of West Virginia like the sound of hell itself opening up. My name is Dave Morrison, and I am a traveling antique dealer from Ohio. 3 weeks ago, I was driving through the back roads of the Appalachians, looking for forgotten treasures in small town shops. That is how I make my living, finding old things that people don't know the value of. I thought I found the score of a lifetime in Booger Hole, West Virginia. Population 43. One general store. One secret that should have stayed buried. The GPS had given up on me hours before. These mountain roads don't exist on any map. They twist and turn like broken bones, disappearing into hollows so deep the sun never touches the bottom. I was running low on gas when I finally saw the weathered sign, Booger Hole, established 1897. The name alone should have been a warning. The general store sat at the only intersection in town, if you could call it that. Paint peeling off the sides like dead skin. Windows so dirty they looked black. A single gas pump that probably hadn't worked since the Carter administration. But I was desperate, and sometimes desperation leads you to exactly where you were not supposed to be. The bell above the door let out a rusty groan as I pushed inside. The smell hit me first. Old wood, dust, and something else. Something sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long on a grave. Behind the counter sat the oldest man I'd ever seen. His skin was paper thin, stretched over bones that looked ready to snap. His eyes were milky white with cataracts, but somehow I knew he could see me perfectly. "You from around here," he said. It wasn't a question. "Just passing through," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Looking for antiques, old things. You got anything interesting?" The old man, his mouth stretched into what might have been a smile. He pointed one gnarled finger toward the back of the store. "Got something real special back there. Been waiting for the right buyer for near 30 years now." That is when I saw it. Sitting on a shelf between mason jars of mysterious pickled things and dusty bottles of patent medicine was a human skull. Not a replica, not a teaching model, the real thing. Yellow with age, with teeth still intact and eye sockets that seemed to follow me as I moved. A small handwritten sign next to it read, "The Screaming Skull -$500 handle with care." That belonged to Jeremiah Wickham, the old man said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Meanest son of a gun ever to walk these mountains. Killed 16 people back in 1923 before they finally caught him. Used to lure folks into his cabin with promises of shelter. Then, he made a cutting motion across his throat. I stepped closer, fascinated despite myself. The skull had an odd weight to it, even from a distance. Like it was pulling at something deep in my chest. They hung him right outside this very store, the old man continued. But his body, well, let's just say it didn't stay in the ground. Found pieces of him scattered all over the mountain. Never did find all of him. Just this, he tapped the shelf next to the skull. Been in my family store ever since. 500 seems steep for. That is when it happened. The skull, his jaw dropped open with a wet clicking sound. and the most horrible scream I ever heard filled the store. It went on for 10 full seconds, a sound like every nightmare you ever had given voice. The windows rattled, dust fell from the ceiling. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. When it stopped, the silence was somehow worse than the scream. That happens sometimes, the old man said calmly, as if a skull had just screamed like a banshee. Usually means something bad is coming, or someone just told a lie in its presence. I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't lie about anything. The skull screamed again. Didn't you? The old man asked, those blind eyes seeming to bore right through me. Told me you were just passing through. But you, are you? You come here looking for something specific, something you heard about. He was right. And somehow the skull knew it. I had heard about Booger Hole from another dealer. Whispered rumors of a store that sold things that shouldn't be sold. Things with histories too dark for most collectors. I'd driven 6 hours out of my way to find this place. How much? I asked. $300. Cash only. I should have walked away. Should have gotten in my car and driven straight back to Ohio. Instead, I pulled out my wallet and counted out the bills. The moment the money touched the old man, his palm, he was already wrapping the skull in an old newspaper, handling it like it might explode. Word of advice, he said as he handed it over. Don't try to silence it when it wants to scream. And whatever you do, don't tell any lies around it. Jeremiah Wickham always did hate a liar. The drive home was a nightmare. Every time I hit a bump in the road, I could hear the skull shifting in its box on the passenger seat. Twice it screamed, once when I passed a car accident, and once when I called my wife to tell her I'd be home soon. I hadn't meant to lie. I had every intention of driving straight home. But somehow, the skull knew I was going to stop at my storage unit first, to hide my purchase before bringing it home. My storage facility is in an industrial part of Columbus, surrounded by empty lots and abandoned buildings. Perfect for storing items that might raise questions. I rented Unit 47B specifically because it was isolated at the end of a long row where nobody else went. The skull was heavier than it looked. As I carried it through the maze of storage units, I could feel it getting warmer through the newspaper wrapping. By the time I reached my unit, the paper was actually hot to the touch. I rolled up the metal door and flicked on the overhead light. My storage unit is organized like a museum, antique furniture arranged by period, boxes of collectibles labeled and categorized, rare books protected in climate-controlled cases. Everything in its place, everything properly cataloged. I set the skull on a Victorian writing desk and carefully unwrapped it. Under the fluorescent light, it looked even more disturbing than it had in the dim store. The bone had an oily sheen to it, and the eye sockets seemed deeper somehow. I could smell that same sweet rotten odor I noticed in the store, stronger now. I pulled out my phone to take photos for my insurance records. That is when I noticed something carved into the base of the skull. So faint I missed it before. Tiny letters scratched into the bone. The truth will set you free, but first it will destroy you. As I read those words aloud, the skull, its jaw began to move. Not the sudden drop of its earlier screams, but a slow, deliberate grinding motion, like it was trying to speak. The sound it made wasn't a scream this time, it was laughter. Low, wet, horrible laughter that seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than the hollow bone should allow. That is when I realized I wasn't alone in the storage unit. The laugh was coming from behind me. I spun around, my heart trying to claw its way out of my throat. Standing in the doorway was a man, or what had once been a man. Tall and gaunt, with skin the color of old parchment. His clothes were the rough homespun fabric of a century ago, stained dark with things I didn't want to identify. But it was his face that made me understand true terror. He had no eyes, just empty sockets, like the skull on the desk. And when he smiled, I could see that his teeth were filed to sharp points. Been waiting a long time for someone to bring me home, he said in a voice like gravel sliding down a mountainside. That old man in the store, he knew what would happen. He knew I'd follow my skull wherever it went. Jeremiah Wickham stepped into the storage unit, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant. My breath came out in visible puffs as he approached the desk where his skull sat grinning. 16 people I killed in those mountains, he said conversationally, running one finger along the skull, his jaw. But that was just practice. Been thinking about it for 90 years, planning what I'd do when I got free again. The skull began to scream, and this time I understood what it was trying to tell me. It wasn't a warning of disasters to come. It was celebrating them. I ran through the maze of storage units, past the sleeping security guard, out into the parking lot where my car sat under a broken streetlight. My hands shook so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. When the engine finally turned over, I gunned it toward the exit without looking back. But in my rearview mirror, I could see him, standing in the doorway of my storage unit, perfectly still, watching me drive away. And I could hear the skull screaming, even over the sound of my engine in the distance between us. That was 3 weeks ago. I haven't been back to the storage unit. I've been staying in a motel on the other side of town, paying cash, afraid to go home to my wife, because I know he is still there, waiting, and I know the skull is still screaming. The worst part, I can hear it even here, 50 miles away. Every night when the sun goes down, that horrible sound echoes through my dreams. And each morning, I wake up to find that the local news has reported another missing person. Someone who was last seen near the industrial district, near my storage facility. Jeremiah Wickham is hunting again. And it is my fault. He is free. But that is not the real horror of this story. The real horror is what I discovered when I finally worked up the courage to research the history of Booger Hole, West Virginia. There is no town by that name. There never was. The GPS coordinates I followed led to nothing but empty forest. The general store I bought the skull from doesn't exist on any map, in any county records, on any satellite image. I've been carrying that newspaper wrapping in my wallet, the paper the old man used to cover the skull. Yesterday, I finally looked at the date. October 15th, 1923, the day before Jeremiah Wickham was supposedly executed. The skull knew I was lying when I said I was just passing through. Because I never went anywhere at all. Somehow, in those twisted mountain roads, I'd driven straight into the past and bought a piece of evil that was never meant to escape. And now it's loose in our world, screaming warnings of disasters that it was creating itself. Listen carefully tonight when you go to sleep. If you hear screaming in the distance, investigate. To go looking for the source. Because Jeremiah Wickham is still out there, still hunting, and his skull is still screaming. And every scream means someone else has just discovered that some things are better left buried in the mountains of West Virginia. Story 9. Ritual Stones of Roan Mountain. What would you do if you discovered that your own ancestors weren't human? I found out last winter on Roan Mountain, and I've been running from the truth ever since. My name is Robert Hayes, and I am a genealogist who specializes in Appalachian family histories. Last December, while researching my own bloodline for a family reunion, I stumbled across records that led me to the stone circles on Roan Mountain, its summit. What I found there changed everything I thought I knew about my heritage and the true history of these ancient peaks. The Cherokee called it Roan Mountain long before the first European settlers arrived, but their name translates to something far more disturbing than the English version. They called it the place where the old ones dance, and they avoided it completely during certain times of the year. The white settlers who named it after the roan-colored rhododendrons never bothered to ask why the Cherokee gave the mountain such a wide berth during the summer and winter solstices. I should have listened to those old warnings instead of driving up that mountain road on December 21st, armed with nothing but a metal detector, a camera, and a foolish determination to solve a family mystery that had haunted my bloodline for over 2 centuries. The stone circles sit on a wind-swept plateau near the mountain's peak, arranged in patterns that make no sense according to any known Native American or European traditions. 7 perfect rings of standing stones, each circle exactly 33 feet in diameter, positioned to form a larger pattern that can only be appreciated from above. The stones themselves are unlike anything found naturally in the Appalachians, a dark basalt that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it. What drew me to these circles wasn't archaeological curiosity. It was a family legend that had been passed down through 5 generations of Hayes men, always whispered in hushed tones and never discussed in front of the women or children. According to the story, our ancestor Ezra Hayes had disappeared on Roan Mountain in 1823, only to return 3 days later fundamentally changed. He lived for another 47 years after that, but neighbors claimed he never aged a single day past the night he vanished. The family Bible contained a single cryptic entry in Ezra's handwriting, dated December 24, 1823. I have seen the true shape of my blood, and it is older than these mountains. The stones remember what we were before we learned to walk upright and speak in tongues of flesh. I had dismissed it as the ramblings of a man driven mad by exposure and hypothermia. But the more I researched, the more I realized that every generation of Hayes men had experienced something on Roan Mountain. My grandfather had spent a night up there in 1952 and came back claiming he could hear voices in languages that predated human speech. My father had hiked the plateau in 1979 and returned with memories of participating in ceremonies he couldn't describe. Both of them had lived unusually long lives, remaining physically strong and mentally sharp well into their 90s. Both of them had refused to talk about what they had experienced on the mountain, taking their secrets to graves that had to be sealed with iron rather than wood, for reasons no one in the family could explain. I reached the stone circles just as the winter sun was setting, casting long shadows across the plateau that seemed to move independently of their sources. The temperature was dropping fast, but the stones themselves radiated a warmth that had nothing to do with absorbed sunlight. As I walked among the circles, my metal detector began picking up readings that made no sense. The stones were metallic, somehow, despite appearing to be carved from solid rock. But it was what I found buried beneath the central circle that changed everything. 3 feet down, my shovel struck something that rang like a bell when disturbed. I brushed away the soil to reveal a metal plate covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. They weren't to Cherokee, weren't to European, weren't to like any human writing system I had ever encountered. But as I stared at them, the symbols began to shift and rearrange themselves, forming patterns that my mind could somehow read despite having no reference for the language they represented. They told the story of the old ones, beings that had walked the earth long before humanity evolved from simpler creatures. The symbols described their appearance, their culture, their technology, and most disturbing of all, their method of ensuring survival across geological ages. They didn't reproduce in the traditional sense. Instead, they planted seeds of their essence in primitive species, dormant genetic material that would activate under specific conditions and begin the process of transformation back to their original forms. Humanity wasn't their only experiment. They had seeded dozens of species across the planet, creating sleeper agents that would awaken when the stars aligned properly and the barriers between dimensions grew thin. The stone circles on Roan Mountain weren't just ceremonial sites. They were activation chambers, designed to trigger the transformation process in individuals who carried the right genetic markers. The Hayes bloodline was one of their most successful implantations. As this knowledge flooded my consciousness, I felt changes beginning in my own body. My vision became sharper, able to perceive spectrums of light that human eyes shouldn't detect. My hearing expanded, picking up subsonic frequencies that revealed a hidden layer of reality buzzing with alien activity. And my sense of smell began detecting chemical signatures that told me stories about the true nature of the world around me. The sun disappeared behind the western peaks, and the stone circles began to glow with bioluminescent patterns that traced themselves across their surfaces like living circuitry. The metal plate in my hands grew warm, then hot, then began to vibrate with harmonies that resonated in my bones. That's when I saw the others. They emerged from the shadows between the stones, beings that had once been human but had completed the transformation process that was just beginning in me. Their basic anatomy was recognizable, but everything about them spoke of fundamental alterations that went beyond simple evolution. They moved with fluid grace that defied the limitations of human joint structure, their limbs able to bend and extend in ways that should have been impossible. Their faces retained human features, but the proportions were wrong in subtle ways that created an uncanny valley effect that made my primitive human brain recoil in instinctive fear. Their eyes were larger and darker, adapted for vision in spectrums that normal humans couldn't access. Their skin had a translucent quality that revealed the flow of circulatory systems that no longer carried mere blood. But the most disturbing change was in their expressions. They looked at me with a mixture of recognition and hunger that spoke of minds that had transcended human limitations while retaining human desires amplified to inhuman extremes. I recognized my grandfather among them, despite the fact that he had been dead for 12 years. The changes in his appearance were more advanced than the others, suggesting that the transformation continued even after death. He approached me with movements that were both graceful and predatory, his altered features showing traces of the man I had known as a child. Behind him came others I didn't recognize but somehow knew were family. Hayes men from previous generations, all drawn back to the mountain by the same genetic compulsion that had brought me here. They formed a circle around me, their altered voices creating harmonics that made the stone circles vibrate in sympathetic resonance. The ritual began without any conscious decision on my part. My body moved according to patterns encoded in DNA that was older than human civilization, participating in ceremonies that predated agriculture, writing, even language as we understand it. The metal plate in my hands became a focal point for energies that flowed through the stone circles, creating a connection between our dimension and whatever realm the old ones currently inhabited. As the ritual progressed, I felt my human identity beginning to dissolve. Memories that belonged to other beings flooded my consciousness, experiences from a time when the continents were arranged differently and creatures that would become humanity still huddled in caves. I saw the Earth as it had been when the old ones ruled it openly, a planet where the laws of physics operated according to different principles and the barriers between thought and reality were permeable. The transformation was painful but also exhilarating. Each change in my cellular structure brought new capabilities, enhanced senses, and access to knowledge that had been locked away in genetic vaults for millions of years. I was becoming something more than human, something that could perceive and manipulate aspects of reality that Homo sapiens had never been designed to access. But part of me fought against the change. The rational, modern part of my mind that had been shaped by education and civilization recognized the horror of what was happening. I was losing my humanity, surrendering my individual identity to become part of a collective consciousness that spanned geological ages. Every trace of Robert Hayes was being overwritten by something ancient and alien. As dawn approached and the ritual reached its climax, I made a choice that surprised even the transformed beings surrounding me. Instead of completing the process, I used the last of my human will to break the connection. The metal plate shattered in my hands, sending shockwaves through the stone circles that caused several of the ancient structures to crack and crumble. The transformed Hayes men howled in languages that had no human equivalent, their forms beginning to fade as the dimensional portal created by the ritual collapsed. My grandfather, his altered features showed something that might have been disappointment or might have been approval before he dissolved into shadow and was gone. I stumbled down the mountain path as the sun rose, my body still changing but the process now incomplete and unstable. The partial transformation left me caught between human and other, able to perceive both realities but belonging fully to neither. I could see the hidden layer of alien activity that permeates our world, but I could no longer ignore it or pretend it doesn't exist. That was 8 months ago, and the changes are still progressing. My reflection in mirrors shows subtle alterations that become more pronounced each day. My family has begun to avoid me, sensing something different in my presence that triggers deep evolutionary fears. And every night, I hear the old ones calling to me from dimensions just beyond the reach of human perception. The stone circles on Roan Mountain are broken now, but the genetic seeds they were designed to activate remain dormant in thousands of bloodlines across Appalachia. The Hayes family ISN, to the only one carrying alien DNA, just the most responsive to the activation process. There are others out there, people who dream of dark ceremonies and feel drawn to high places during the solstices, not understanding that they responding to genetic programming millions of years old. I've tried to warn them to reach out to families with similar histories and unexplained longevity. But most people aren't ready to accept that their ancestors weren't entirely human, that humanity itself might be nothing more than a temporary phase in a larger evolutionary plan designed by beings whose true forms would drive us mad. The transformation in my body is accelerating now, approaching some kind of critical threshold that I can predict or control. Soon, I want to be human enough to feel guilt about what I've learned or fear about what I'm becoming. The Robert Hayes who climbed Roan Mountain last winter will cease to exist, replaced by something that remembers being human but is no longer bound by human limitations or morality. When that happens, I'll return to the mountain and rebuild the stone circles. The ritual will begin again, and this time, there will be no human will left to resist the calling of the old ones. They waited millions of years to reclaim this world. A few more decades while their children complete their metamorphosis is nothing to beings who measure time in geological epochs. But their patience is finally nearing an end, and the stars are aligning for their return. The stone circles were just the beginning. Story 10. Thing in Tweetsea Tunnel, did you know that trains can simply disappear? Not derail, not crash, not get stuck. Just vanish into darkness and never come back out. I never believed it until I saw the records buried deep in the North Carolina State Archives, filed under a classification that made my blood run cold. Unexplained military losses. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I am a railroad historian. Last summer, I was researching Civil War transportation routes when I stumbled across something that should have stayed buried. A Confederate supply train carrying $2 million in gold bullion entered Tweetsee Tunnel on March 15, 1865. It never emerged from the other side. The official report blamed Union saboteurs, but the investigator's handwritten notes told a different story. No explosion damage, no cave-ins, no bodies. The tunnel was clear from both ends, but the train, its crew, and its cargo had simply ceased to exist somewhere in the mile-long darkness between the mountains. I should have left it alone, should have filed my research and moved on to safer historical mysteries. Instead, I drove to the abandoned tunnel last October, carrying nothing but a flashlight, a digital recorder, and a foolish determination to solve a 160-year-old puzzle. Tweetsee Tunnel sits in a forgotten valley between two peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains, accessible only by a gravel road that hasn't seen maintenance since the Carter administration. The railroad company sealed both entrances with concrete barriers in 1987, claiming structural instability, but the locals had different theories. They spoke in whispers about sounds that echoed from inside the mountain on foggy nights. The distant whistle of a phantom locomotive, the rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails that no longer existed. The eastern entrance loomed before me like a concrete tombstone, weathered gray and covered in decades of graffiti. But as I climbed over the barrier with my equipment, I noticed something that made my historian's instincts scream warnings. Fresh scratches in the concrete, deep gouges that looked like claw marks, each one as wide as my hand and carved with enough force to bite through steel-reinforced barriers. The tunnel mouth opened into absolute darkness. My flashlight beam barely penetrated 20 feet before being swallowed by shadows that seemed to move independently of my light source. The air inside was wrong somehow. Too cold for October, and thick with a metallic taste that reminded me of old blood and rusted iron. As I walked deeper into the tunnel, my footsteps echoed strangely, creating a rhythm that sounded almost like marching boots. The railroad ties had been removed decades ago, but I could still feel their phantom presence beneath my feet, as if the mountain itself remembered the weight of countless trains that had passed through this passage. 50 yards in, I found the first anomaly, a section of tunnel wall that looked newer than the rest, as if it had been rebuilt or repaired sometime after the original construction. I ran my flashlight along the stonework, noting the different color of mortar and the way the newer stones seemed to fit imperfectly with their neighbors. But what drew my attention wasn't the shoddy repair work. It was what I could see through the gaps between the stones. Gold, thin veins of actual gold thread running through the rock behind the wall like metallic cancer. But this wasn't natural ore formation. The metal had been melted and poured, then allowed to cool in organic, flowing patterns that resembled blood vessels or root systems. Someone, or something, had sealed precious metal inside the mountain itself. My digital recorder was picking up sounds I couldn't hear with my naked ears. When I played back the first few minutes of audio, underneath my own breathing and footsteps, there was something else. A faint rhythmic sound that could have been a heartbeat, or could have been the distant chuffing of a steam engine struggling up a mountain grade. 300 yards into the tunnel, I found the gold. Not coins or bars, but individual nuggets scattered across the tunnel floor like breadcrumbs leading deeper into the darkness. Each piece was roughly the size of a silver dollar, and when I picked one up, it was warm to the touch despite the freezing air. The metal seemed to pulse in my palm, and for a moment, I could swear I heard whispers coming from inside the gold itself. The nuggets led me deeper into the tunnel than any tourist or urban explorer had ever gone. Past the halfway point where most people turned back. Past the section where the temperature dropped another 10 degrees and my breath began forming visible clouds in the beam of my flashlight. Past the place where the tunnel walls began showing scorch marks that looked fresh despite being over a century old. That's when I heard the whistle. Not a recording or an echo from the outside world, but the authentic steam whistle of a Civil War-era locomotive, coming from somewhere ahead of me in the impenetrable darkness. The sound was followed by the unmistakable clatter of iron wheels on steel rails, growing louder with each passing second. I pressed myself against the tunnel wall as the phantom train approached, my heart hammering so hard I was sure it would give me away to whatever was bearing down on me. The sounds grew deafening, accompanied now by the hiss of steam and the rhythmic puffing of an engine under heavy load. I could feel vibrations through the stone walls, as if a massive weight was actually passing through the tunnel. But no light preceded the sound. No headlamp or lantern glow announced the approaching locomotive. Just the crushing audio presence of a train that cast no shadow and threw no illumination. As the sounds reached their peak, something else joined the phantom symphony. Human voices, calling out in panic and terror. Confederate soldiers screaming orders that made no sense, yelling about something in the darkness that was taking their friends one by one. I heard the sharp crack of rifle fire, the metallic ring of sabers being drawn, and underneath it all, a sound that human vocal cords should never be able to produce. A wet, sliding noise that spoke of something massive moving through spaces too small to contain it. Something that breathed without lungs and moved without legs, flowing through the darkness like liquid shadow given hunger and purpose. The phantom train passed through my position, and for one terrifying moment, I felt something brush against my shoulder. Not fabric or metal, but something organic and cold that left a trail of moisture on my jacket. In that instant of contact, images flooded my mind that nearly drove me to my knees. I saw the Confederate gold train entering the tunnel on that March day in 1865. Its cars loaded with bullion meant to fund the dying Confederacy, its last desperate campaigns. I saw the crew, its confusion when they realized the tunnel was longer than it should be, stretching deeper into the mountain than any human engineering could account for. I saw their growing terror as they encountered the thing that had been sleeping in the deepest chambers of the mountain since long before the first human foot touched this continent. The creature that the Cherokee had known about and avoided for centuries. The thing they had sealed away with ceremonies and warnings, only to watch helplessly as white settlers blasted a tunnel straight into its lair. The train had awakened it, and in its hunger, the creature had consumed everything. Locomotive, cars, crew, and cargo, absorbing their substance while leaving their echoes to replay endlessly in the darkness. The gold hadn't been stolen or hidden. It had been digested, broken down, and incorporated into the creature's form, only to be regurgitated as bait for future victims. As the phantom sounds faded, I found myself standing in a section of tunnel I had never seen before. My flashlight revealed walls that curved and twisted in ways that defied the straight-line engineering of railroad construction. The stone here was different too, smoother and slightly warm to the touch, with a texture that reminded me uncomfortably of skin. The gold nuggets were everywhere now, scattered so thickly on the ground that I had to step carefully to avoid slipping. But I no longer wanted to touch them. Not after seeing the visions of what had happened to their original owners. That's when I realized I wasn't alone in this twisted section of tunnel. Something was watching me from the darkness ahead, just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam. I could feel its attention like a physical weight, pressing down on me with the force of centuries of patient hunger. When I tried to shine my light toward it, the beam seemed to bend and curve away, as if the creature's presence actually warped the laws of physics around it. But I could hear it breathing. Slow, wet inhalations that seemed to draw air from impossible distances, followed by exhalations that carried the stench of decay and gold-tinged corruption. Each breath lasted longer than any living thing should be able to sustain, as if the creature's lungs were the size of train cars. I started backing away, my feet sliding on the scattered gold as I tried to retrace my path to the tunnel entrance. But the passage behind me was no longer familiar. The walls had shifted while I wasn't looking, creating new curves and angles that led to dead ends or chambers that couldn't possibly exist inside a mountain. The creature began to move. I heard it first as a sound like wet concrete being poured, accompanied by the scrape of something massive dragging itself across stone. Then came the smell, a combination of sulfur, rotting vegetation, and that underlying metallic scent of old gold. My flashlight began to flicker, its beam growing dimmer with each passing second, as if the creature was somehow draining the battery just by being near. In the fading light, I caught my first glimpse of the thing that had been haunting Tweetsea Tunnel for over a century and a half. It wasn't a single creature. It was a mass of shadow and flesh that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, flowing and reshaping itself as it moved through the impossible geometry of its lair. Parts of it were recognizably organic, writhing tentacles and grasping appendages that ended in what looked like human hands. But other sections defied description, appearing as gaps in reality itself, voids that hurt to look at directly. And throughout its form, gleaming like infected veins, ran rivers of molten gold that pulsed and flowed with each of the creature's massive heartbeats. The thing had absorbed the Confederate gold train so completely that the metal had become part of its anatomy. I could see fragments of the locomotive embedded in its flesh, wheels and pistons that still moved in phantom rhythm, steam gauges that registered impossible pressures from systems that no longer existed in any recognizable form. But worst of all were the faces. Dozens of human faces pressed just beneath the creature, his surface, their mouths open in eternal screams that would never make sound. The train crew, the soldiers, everyone who had entered this tunnel over the decades and never returned, all of them preserved in the creature, its mass, aware and suffering but unable to die. As I watched in horror, one of the faces turned toward me with recognition. The train engineer, his cap still somehow perched on his head despite being part of something that should have dissolved him completely. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't to hear but could read clearly. Run. I ran, through passages that changed direction when I wasn't, to looking, past walls that breathed and floors that felt like they were digesting my footsteps. I fled toward what I hoped was the tunnel entrance. Behind me, the creature gave chase, and the sound it made as it moved was like a derailed freight train trying to scream. My flashlight died completely, leaving me in absolute darkness broken only by the golden glow of the creature, its veins as it flowed through the tunnel behind me. That organic light cast shadows that moved independently, reaching toward me with grasping motions that promised an eternity of conscious absorption. I stumbled over the concrete barrier and fell face first into the gravel parking area where I had left my car. The October sunlight felt like salvation after the impossible darkness of the tunnel, and I lay there gasping for several minutes before I trusted my legs to carry me to the vehicle. But as I fumbled with my car keys, I felt something in my jacket pocket that hadn't been there before. A single gold nugget, warm and pulsing like a tiny heart. In my panic to escape, I had inadvertently brought a piece of the creature with me. That was 6 months ago. Since then, the gold nugget has been growing. Every morning, I find that it is slightly larger than it was the day before. And recently, they started hearing whispers coming from inside the metal. Voices of the Confederate soldiers, the train crew, and others who made the mistake of entering Tweetsea Tunnel. They recalling to me, telling me to return to the mountain. They promised me riches beyond imagination if they'll just bring the gold back where it belongs. But I've seen what those riches cost, and I know that the creature isn't content to wait passively in its lair anymore. It is growing stronger, feeding on the connection I inadvertently created by taking part of its substance. And someday soon, it won't need the tunnel anymore. It will flow out into the world, following the trail of gold back to me, and then spreading across the landscape like a plague of living shadow and molten metal. The thing in Tweetsea Tunnel isn't just hungry. It is patient. It's been waiting since before human civilization began, and it knows that eventually, everyone who carries its mark will return to feed its eternal appetite. I can feel it calling to me even now, promising an end to the nightmares if I'll just drive back to that mountain valley and walk into the darkness one more time. That was tonight's descent into the Appalachian dark, but the mountains are never truly quiet. Thank you for wandering this path with me. If you felt a chill tonight, subscribe and tap the bell so you'll know when the next story slips through the pines. I'd love to read your own strange encounters or even just where in the world you're tuning in from. Drop it in the comments below. Until next time, keep your lantern close. In these hills, the night never ends. It only waits for you to return.